So the title of this presentation is called, it's specifically Receiving Tubes in the Post-War Years. Who made them, who rebranded them, and when did it all come to a screeching halt? What we're going to talk about is the tube business in the United States in the years following World War II, the rise and the fall of the golden years of the industry, the rebranders, of which there were many, the sunset years of the industry, and what remains of the industry today. What we're not going to cover are, transmitting special purpose small manufacturers, Western Electric, and modern and current production tubes, and of course, most of the stuff from the pre-war era. So I start off by the question I have gotten over the years, which is, who are you and what do you know about tubes, kid? I say kid because I got into this stuff when I was about 13 years old. And that was at the very, very tail end of the tube era. I guess being 13 and fixing televisions and radios and stereo stuff, I guess I was getting all the little old ladies on a fixed income who were willing to trust their set to a 13-year-old kid to fix. So most of what I was working on was either tube stuff or really early transistor stuff. And as what that played into is I kind of played cleanup crew to a lot of repair shops and jobbers who were, as I said, hemorrhaging obsolete tube stocks. And since that's what I was working on, I was kind of in my glory, just taking stuff. They were just giving it to me. It kind of placed me in a unique position and in possession of hundreds of thousands of tubes of all sorts before I knew it. And that was a problem. Faced with an ever-growing pile of tubes, I had to learn quickly what they were for, who could use them, and what to throw away. And it kind of started an odyssey that I could never have imagined. I've spent the last 9 years buying and selling tubes. I currently have several 100,000 tubes, and I have learned through experience and from many of the old timers and old books on the subject. And with tubes, as with life in general, you never stop learning. So let's talk about tubes. The major player manufacturers, RCA made tubes in their Harrison, New Jersey plant, and a small number of more special purpose and television camera tubes in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. GE manufactured tubes in the post-war era in Owensboro, Kentucky. They purchased the Kenrad plant and retooled it for their own. Sylvania manufactured in Emporium, Pennsylvania, and in Altoona. Tungsol was manufacturing in Newark, New Jersey. Westinghouse manufactured tubes in Bloomfield, and CBS Hytron manufactured tubes in Danvers, Massachusetts. There were other manufacturers much smaller. The tube rebranders. Tube rebranding is generally thought of as a nefarious practice, reselling of factory seconds or used sometimes tested polls. In actuality, tube rebranding was a common practice performed by all of the reputable tube manufacturers as well as large store chains, OEM equipment manufacturers, and of course the advertisers in the electronic magazines selling what they generally referred to as standard brand tubes. I'm going to make the differentiation here because I've had people complain when I've said this in the past. There were rebranders, as in resellers of either surplus or second quality tubes, and there were rebranders who had exchange agreements with other manufacturers or were OEM suppliers who don't fall into the same category. Examples of the reject peddlers are any tube sold in standard brand boxes, New Jersey Radio Tube, Radtel, Sheldon, Cornell. The list is really endless. Quick Check. It seems to be there were different rebranders in different areas. They generally advertised in the back of Electronics World magazine, the back of electronic servicing, you name it. If you look here, of course, I can't point, or I can use my mouse, right? Okay. If we look over here, if you can see it, most of these rebranders were in Harrison, New Jersey. Coincidence or convenience to location of the RCA tube plant? Um, when you think of rebranders, you think of the boxes here on the left. This one is these are standard brand New Jersey radio tube. And then you have the private label tubes. None of these companies ever manufactured tubes. But Sears, for instance, sold them and put them in OEM equipment. Same with Lafayette. Here we have Western Auto True Tone, Bradford from W.T. Grant, Montgomery Ward had Airline, and the list goes on and on. Then you had the quality rebrands, for instance, Zenith, Magnavox, Fisher, and Dumont. After the war, none of them made any tubes, but they all sold, quality equipment with name brand tubes. And a lot of times they will even say, Magnavox tube by RCA or what have you. Most OEM manufacturers simply purchased tubes and branded them, but certain manufacturers wanted to provide an all-encompassing supply chain. So a Zenith dealer would at one point have been expected to sell a full line of Zenith tubes and so on and so forth. Every U.S. tube manufacturer, to some degree, rebranded tubes under agreement. And they did this for many reasons, one of which is because certain tubes were made only by one manufacturer, but provided by all. A good example is the new Vistor, which in the United States was generally only manufactured by RCA until their exit from the tube business, at which time Sylvania purchased the tooling. To add to that, the Japanese did manufacture new Vistors at one point. I believe Toshiba had licensed them from RCA. Many OEM manufacturers, we said, sold full lines of tubes, yet manufactured none. In the end, Westinghouse and RCA branded tubes were nearly all rebranded products made by GE, Sylvania, and overseas producers. And Raytheon, as a lot of you guys have probably seen, was the first to cease production in the late 50s and market largely imported product, and they were doing it at a slightly cheaper price. At some point in the late 50s, early 60s, there was a rise in awareness within the service industry, and RCA and other leading companies, they started to monitor the disposition of their rejects. There's an interesting article in an old Electronics World magazine that shows tubes being loaded into a crushing machine, because and the article was about combating the rebranders who were selling second tubes that were disposed out the back door of the plants. Many of the rebranders were gone by the late 60s, and those that did exist were generally selling used or surplus military tubes, which were actually usually of decent quality if they were military surplus. Standard brand was more of a box than a tube. The standard brand boxes were printed and marketed to rebranders or individuals, and the big seller of these was Barry Electronics in New York City, who until the mid 60s was one of the largest wholesale tube outfits in the country. They published a catalog called the Green Sheet. I have some of them around here, and they wholesale all kinds of tubes at deep discounts for large quantities. So the question is, who made the tube? When it came to the most popular types, most of the major manufacturers produced a full line, with exceptions. Tubes were produced in runs. That is, a tube plant would tool up and produce a run of certain type, or example, a 6AU6, fill their inventory needs for or expectations for an expected or set period of time. Sometimes these expectations would run short and orders would need to be filled. To this end, RCA, Sylvania, GE, Westinghouse, and the others all entered into agreements to sell tubes to each other as needed. This is why you will frequently find new old stock examples by these manufacturers that are clearly not made by them. In the post-war period, Zenith, for instance, did not produce tubes after about 1957, at which point they generally sold quality tubes from other manufacturers. Admiral, who marketed a complete line of tubes, were entirely outsourced. Same with Magnavox. Magnavox did market some Japanese product, and Fisher, for example, was a much smaller company, but with their niche market, they in the early '60s they marketed a line of premium hi-fi tubes, which were matched in some cases. They were aimed at the higher end audio market, and these were usually either European or U.S. manufacturers. Other OEM equipment makers did sell lines of replacement tubes. So here are some examples of tubes of one manufacturer clearly made by another. If you look on the left here, here is a General Electric 6CA7 or EL34, which has a big fat bottle, and this is an American-made tube. But on the up here, this is a GE 6CA7, but if you this is clearly made, and it actually says made in Great Britain. This is a Mullard product sold with GE labeling in a GE box. These tubes were not made in the United States until the mid 60s, when GE started making the larger bottle version. And the reason that it has the larger bottle is they based it on their extant 6L6 and 6550 production lines. On the right, we have an RCA EM84 I-tube 6FG6. No manufacturer ever produced these in the United States, but yet you see them sold by almost every American tube manufacturer. Now, GE never made new Vistors, but as you can see, we have a GE 6CW4. And while it says RCA, RCA never manufactured a coin-based tube, and this 7591 is clearly a General Electric product. And the box, by the way, for that 7591 shows Deptford, New Jersey, as the location of RCA's tube division. No tubes were ever manufactured in Deptford, so this is a post-76 tube. Here we have another example. Here are some 7868s RCA boxed with their top evacuation nipples. RCA never made them with top nipples. They made bottom evacuation nipples. Here we have GEs. Here's the reversal. Here we have GEs that were made by RCA. So these were clearly made at a time when GE was making their own, but apparently ran out, so they sourced them from RCA. It's so confusing. Well, not really. The reasons the manufacturers sold to each other is that certain types required very special equipment to manufacture. Vistors, for example, and it was easier for them to purchase them wholesale from another manufacturer. As we said before, stocks ran out and idle lines were not available, where RCA may have had all their lines running, making other tubes, and Sylvania had an excess of 6 AU6s. They would sometimes material shortages or low demand types were a good example where RCA wasn't going to make 100,000 2A3s in 1963, or Sylvania or vice versa. So they would see who had them and rebrand them. In the end, when the production lines were shutting down, RCA had to completely outsource their tube line. You had tube importers, and Raytheon was one of the first. They were a tube manufacturer. They got out of the business in '58, and everything was pretty much Japanese, occasionally from other American manufacturers. Channel Master was another one, notorious for importing Japanese tubes. ITT for a very short time was selling tubes. Sonotone never made tubes and imported a lot of Western European tubes, a lot like Fisher did. International Electronics is an interesting one. They started out as the sole distributor for Mullard tubes in the 50s. And then they did things later that gets a little interesting. Amprex was a manufacturer of transmitting tubes. They were purchased by Philips, and the name was used to sell Philips tubes from the Netherlands in the United States. And you get into the sunset years. The introduction of the transistor into consumer products was the very beginning of the end. While they initially cost more, transistor prices and the prices of their associated components eventually began to come down. You know, the big one with transistors is when you had a transistor table radio, you had to have a power transformer. You couldn't do the series string set anymore with transistors initially, and that transformer cost money, which is one of the reasons the AA5s kind of hung on as long as they did, is because it was actually cheaper to make them a tube radio. You could make a $14 tube radio, but you couldn't do that with transistors in the beginning. By 1974, nearly all receiving tubes have been phased out of new equipment production. And by 1980, receiving tube sales began to decline precipitously. By 1975, the only new products being built with tubes were super low-end television receivers sold at rock-bottom prices. And part of that game was to use up stocks of tubes and components associated with the tubes. I'm sure most people here remember the infamous GE Portacolor and the flood of 13-inch black and white sets that were common in the mid-70s. Some ham and CB base, the base units and ham equipment certainly continued to use tubes. I have a 1979 production Sonar FS2340 that's all tubes, except for its the digital display, kind of interesting digital display with tubes. Commercial public address amplifiers were a big one, as the stigma was tubes were better suited to the purpose due to their relative ease of service and ability of tube amplifiers to withstand overloads and output shorts. I worked for the New York school system. They specified tube-based equipment for school PA systems until Bogan and Stromberg Carlson ceased production in 1977. There were tubes in use in the schools in Staten Island well into the late 90s. Lower production in high-end audio equipment. The Dynaco Stereo 70, of course, was produced into the 80s by the original manufacturer. And the other part of this that I left out is drive-in movie theaters. Big market for tube audio equipment because the amplifiers were not so bothered by lightning strikes, and speaker poles in a field make great antennas, and a bad lightning storm without a direct hit could a static hit could wipe out the finals of a transistor amplifier. So they were, even to this day, a lot of drive-ins have moved to carrier current and low power transmitters, but the ones that still use speaker poles, half of them are still using old Bogan or Altec amplifiers, because even the newer transistor stuff the newer solid state stuff handles the static better, but a lot of them will still press on with the tubes. Here's some key dates. 1959, RCA introduced the new Vistor. 1960, GE introduced the Compactron. 1961, RCA introduces the Novar tube. The Compactrons, the Novars, and the new Vistors were some of the last new tubes introduced. One of the very last tubes introduced was the 8417 which was a beam power audio tube. And it was introduced, I think, in 64, late 63, early 64. That was about the end of it. 1966, tube production peaks. 1967, Westinghouse exited the tube manufacturing business. 1969, I picked Fisher because I actually have conclusive data on this. They sold their last tube-based stereo receivers was the 400. The venerable 500C had been discontinued in 68, and we believe that the 400s being sold in 69 were basically leftover units. Zenith produced their last tube radio in 1969. It was the lowest cost in the line. And by 1974, by all official accounts, the last tube television receivers to utilize receiving tubes were produced. This is incorrect, but a position maintained by many industry historians. Why do I say this is incorrect? Because I had a General Electric Portacolor across my bench that was dated from the factory in 1979, and I have spoken to people who have seen them with a 1980 date on them. 75, RCA fully ceases production of all receiving tube product and shuts down the Harrison plant, which at that time was considered to be the most antiquated tube plant. Bogan produced their last tube-based PA amps in 1977. Stromberg, Carlson, and Duquesne, and the other Precision pretty much did the same. 1980, this is when the last Portacolors I've seen or know of utilized tubes. And in 1993, GE shut down the Owensboro plant, and they produced their last run of tubes, effectively ending receiving tube production in the United States. Another interesting fact is I personally ran across a Zenith digitally tuned console from 1982 that had a horizontal output tube, damper tube, shunt regulator, and tube high voltage section. I guess they found some tubes to use up. In the end, RCA's Harrison tube plant, as we said, was the least modern in the industry when it shut down. RCA ramped up production, ran 24 hours a day, and attempted to build up stock by their estimation to last until 1980. Warehousing was done in Deptford, New Jersey. Sylvania purchased RCA's Nuvistor tooling and some other tooling and continued production in the Emporium, Pennsylvania plant, ultimately which was purchased by North American Phillips and ending tube production in 88. GE was the last man standing, although they did not produce tubes themselves. They licensed the name and leased the plant to Richardson Industries MPD division and continued to produce various tubes that were still in demand until 1993. The last receiving tube produced in the U.S. was a 6550A. A lot of what that was keeping that plant alive were government contracts, but they also sold to the general public. In the 80s and 90s, demand fell off precipitously. Still, there was demand and tubes were needed. Rebranding began again and became an ever more nefarious business. Brands like International Service Master and the Blue Box. And this gets interesting because IEC, International Electronics, was the importer of very high quality Mullard tubes, but they lost that franchise agreement in the 70s, and then went out on their own. They were in, I believe, Hapag, New York, or Hicksville, New York, and their quality really you could be getting a great tube or some real garbage. Procom was another one. Westinghouse was Elmira Electronics. That was just a distributor, and they basically sold anything they could get. They were pretty good. I'll show you those boxes in a little bit. National, Elmenco, and others began to buy up stocks of anything they could find, and they would label the tubes with any number they needed, provided the tube was a functional substitute in most situations. This caused a lot of service headaches and further hastened the transition from tube equipment. On the left side, you'll see some end game rebrander boxes. And on the right side, you'll see a case of Westinghouse tube boxes. When Elmira Electronics ceased selling tubes, they had thousands of these boxes. They were wholesaled out, and I actually, from the company that bought them, I purchased several cases of boxes because I sell, quality used tubes, and they're good quality boxes. As you can see, the things were starting to scrape bottom, and as the years went on, things went bad from worse. Most tube equipment was regarded as end of life, and demand for high quality replacement tubes transitioned to a take what you can get because tubes are becoming scarce. And this is it's part of my hall of shame that I'm going to show you now. Well, what happened here? Here we have an RCA 6L6GC, which is nothing more than a Soviet 6P3S. And they branded it 6L6GC, printed the RCA name on it. Surely wasn't an RCA, but there it is. And on the right side, we have a national 7581, another Soviet 6P3S, and an actual GE 7581 on the right for comparison. Is it doing that? Okay. Here we have, again, a Raytheon 6L6GC, but it's clearly another Soviet 6P3. This was becoming common. I have Sylvanias. I've seen it in almost every brand. And here's a dishonorable mention. When you are desperate to sell 7591s and you got a lot of 6GH8s, you make a printed circuit board and solder it to the bottom of the tube to rearrange the pins. This has got to be one of the most creative, well, I don't know quite what I would call it. Here's a nice, I don't know what you'd call this. Seeking legitimacy. United was at one time a manufacturer of high quality transmitting tubes. They were reduced to a rebrander of remaining stocks of receiving tubes, and they kind of made their boxes look like another familiar brand. I don't think that was an accident. While a lot of these substitutions would have functioned to an extent, the Soviet 6P3 could not withstand the voltages of the 6L that the 6L6GC was rated for, let alone a 7581, and it would have had a greatly shortened lifespan. And the 6GH8, while similar to a 7199, did not have the shielding and the braided heater, and would have introduced hum in some circuits. These substitutions were commonplace. 1R5 sold as 1L6s, 6AU6s sold as 6HR6s. If it would work somewhat, some companies would tell you anything you wanted to hear. I came across a bulk package of 100 6AU6s labeled Elmenco. When we put them into service, they were failing within a year in light service, and I don't know this for certain, but I suspect they may have been a higher voltage AU6, which when brand new would have enough emission to work at a lower heater voltage, like a 9 AU6 or something. But as soon as they got some life they use on them, they didn't do it. Some key points: tubes, unlike transistors, were primarily an East Coast industry. Certain tubes, while in common usage they are commonly used here, were never produced domestically. For example, the I-tube, the EM84, and others. A manufacturer's name on a tube does not necessarily guarantee they made it. And when purchasing new old stock tubes for critical applications, let the buyer beware, especially if it's a later, a manufacturer's later branded tube. Things got really, really dicey with the later tubes. And that's the end. And the picture you see at the end is a General Electric 6550, probably produced in the very early 90s. And that pretty much is the end of the American tube industry.